Welcome to Dig, a history podcast.
We all have that curmudgeonly relative who, at the holiday table, laments the end of the good old days when social media wasn't a thing and everyone knew everyone, people answered their doors when someone knocked on them, and business was done face to face. In some ways, he's right. Digital technology has made job searching, hiring, college applications, and reference letters much less personal than these activities were 50 years ago. But history tells us that, thankfully, your grumpy and probably slightly racist relative is mostly wrong. Even in 2016, a recent survey of over 3,000 employees showed that as many as 85% of jobs were obtained through personal networking. Mm-hmm. What's more is that employment agencies and classified job ads have a much longer history than you might think. 300 years ago, long before the advent of the interwebs, someone else's curmudgeonly relative sat at the holiday table bemoaning the decline of personal interaction. Today, I'm giving all a sneak peek into some of the research I'm doing for my close-ish to done dissertation, and Sarah is along for the ride. Now I know what you're thinking. Marissa, aren't you dissertating about boobs or something? That is correct. I am indeed. But one of the most important parts of understanding the life experiences of wet nurses in the 18th century is understanding the transformation of their trade. This bit of research has led me to the brief history of early modern employment agencies. And don't worry, we'll talk about boobs and class and race and poverty and all the fun stuff too.
Good.
I'm Marissa.
And I'm Sarah.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig.
Starting around 1600, most of northwestern Europe, notably England, Scotland, the Netherlands, northwestern France, northwestern Germany, and Scandinavia, underwent rapid structural urbanization. In 1500, there were only 30 cities in all of northwestern Europe, and none of them contained more than 80,000 people. In 1600, there were still only 30 cities in northwest Europe, and all of them remained small except for one, London. Between 1600 and 1800, the number of cities more than tripled from 30 to 105. By 1800, there were 5 cities which had more than 80,000 people, and London had reached the 1 million mark. Now, this was not just natural increase. Birth rates were actually low in early modern cities, and mortality was high. These many massive urban centers grew as Europeans fled the countryside in search of work in the city. So as cities grew, countrysides suffered depopulation. Prior to the depopulation of the countryside, rural areas had been good places for people to find work. In fact, early versions of job fairs, called hiring fairs, statute fairs, or colloquially mop fairs, were held annually in November in many market towns, most famously in Yorkshire towns like Hornsey and Pocklington.
I just included them because they're great. I just love the names.
That's it. I'm moving to Pocklington. James and I have said for years and years and years that we want to move to Yorkshire because a bunch of the shows that we watch, the British shows that we watch, are set in Yorkshire, and it's just so beautiful. Like, it's so green and hilly, and it's beautiful. So maybe we should move to Pocklington.
Yeah, Pocklington.
So this was all part of a long tradition of regulated labor in England. The 1351 Statute of Laborers established these fairs after the Black Death caused massive labor shortages in agricultural communities. The Statutes of Artificers in 1563, which we've mentioned, I think, a few times for its attempt to control women's reproduction, also set a day each year when shire magistrates, they were hobbits, would set pay rates and employment conditions for the following year. Then, at the mop fair, male and female laborers would gather to negotiate employment arrangements for the following year. As large gatherings of people are wont to do, these mop fairs usually devolved into huge parties with feasts, drinking, dancing, and other recreational pastimes, which basically we mean sex.
As Europe became more urban, so did the people who lived there. And urbanites developed new modes of arranging employment. Structural urbanization, which is the process that Sarah described above, illustrates the physical movement of people from one area to another. But we're interested in behavioral urbanization. Behavioral urbanization refers to the process of change in people's lifestyles, modes of conduct, and points of view as their living environments change. In 1500, there were 3.4 million people in all of northwestern Europe who lived urban lifestyles. So this is no small number. That's kind of a lot of people, and probably more than most people would think in 1500.
Definitely.
But by 1800, there were 12.2 million urbanites in Europe, and 1 million of them lived in the same city, London. The city was populated almost entirely by migrants and foreigners who were underemployed in the countryside or in their place of origin. In a society that's assumed to have operated on face-to-face communications, letter writing, and complex personal networks, how did people new to the city secure employment? They knew few people, usually didn't have marketable skills, and changed jobs frequently because of fluctuating markets. Most ordinary Londoners struggled to find places, as they called them, or jobs, because they lived in an urban market saturated by potential labor as migrants continued to arrive. Keep in mind, this is before or right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which created droves of unskilled jobs for migrants. So it was tough. Unsurprisingly then, workers and employers began to invest in organized employment streams, which promised to connect them with prospective employers. Today, we call these employment agencies or possibly temp agencies. Workers and employers also began using the burgeoning newspaper industry to place classified advertisements, to find places, or to fill vacancies, respectively.
These activities evolved slowly, spurred by increasing need, sometimes even desperation. In societies with few literate people, town criers were used to spread news of job openings, items for sale, lost items, or even missing people. Can I pause for a second? And I also just want to point out, Marissa wrote this episode. Town criers were a real thing.
Yeah.
They just walk up and down the with a bell.
Did you think that was a made-up
Why
thing?
wouldn't they be a real
I don't know. I mean, not that, I don't mean to say that I thought that it was fake. I always just thought that just seemed so funny.
Yeah,
I just can't picture them being like, and now it's like NPR, but on the foot, right?
Yeah.
Joe Smith is hiring a dairymaid.
Yeah, no, that's...
Hear ye, hear ye.
Well, I think it was kind of unofficial, and I think that there was sometimes just men who were like, hey, I don't have a job, and I'm just meandering around anyway. How about you give me a shilling, and I'll,
announce
your stuff.
Weird.
Yeah, I don't think it was like
Sally is having a yard sale.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So it was a real thing. Correct.
Okay. Sorry. That was an aside, mostly to educate me, and I'm dumb. In 1550, only 16% of Brits were literate. This number improved to 53% by 1650. These figures are skewed since they include urban and rural areas. In cities, literacy rates were usually much higher. In 1750 London, as many as 92% of men and 74% of women were able to read. In Amsterdam, the literacy rate hovered around 85% in the 1780s. This new generation of literate city folk developed new modes of sharing information beyond gossip and the town crier, telling people where the yard sales were.
After 1650, post offices, coffee houses, pubs, and newspaper offices began to display notice boards where locals could pin announcements about place openings, lost items, goods for sale, or laborers looking for work. The descriptions were typically brief and included a means to get in touch with a poster. Usually, respondents to a notice approached the proprietor of the establishment where the notice was posted, and then he or she would tell them how to get in touch with the author of the notice. Sometimes posters left either direct contact information, such as an address where they lodged, or indirect contact information, such as the name or address of a local artisan or professional who could serve as an intermediary. This anonymized the hiring process. People were more likely than ever to hire someone they'd never met or enter the employ of a proprietor they'd never heard of. As migrants flocked to early modern cities, this anonymized method of finding employment became increasingly common and complex. Migrants were unlikely to have helpful contacts in their new city. This was a common complaint among city dwellers. In June 1740, the London Magazine ran an editorial proposing an intelligence office for marriage. That is, my friends, a dating service. If Londoners were willing to use anonymized dating services, it's unsurprising that systemized and anonymized forms of place and servant hunting also became more popular.
This was also true of colonial American cities. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were North America's largest cities, but in the 18th century they were tiny demographically and geographically in comparison to those in Europe. But they were growing more rapidly than their European counterparts and had very high population densities. In Philadelphia, for example, the average population density was an incredibly high 50,000 per square mile in 1800. This is close to the population density of Manhattan today. So even though American cities were small, they were urban in character and their inhabitants had been behaviorally urbanized by 1700. Unlike in England, in the American colonies, migrants to the cities were usually far from home and knew no one. Until 1815, Philadelphia was the primary destination of immigrants to the North American continent. But the port cities like Boston and New York were also growing rapidly. In this sense, these small American cities were even more cosmopolitan than European cities, where migrants tended to have friends or family a short distance outside the city limits. We also can't forget that there were several sources of unfree and exploitative labor. Ships full of European indentured servants, as well as pools of enslaved blacks for sale or short-term hire, and recently freed blacks looking for work.
These fluctuating and rootless populations prevented the development of personal networks and made it hard for workers to find work and for employers to fill vacancies. Philadelphian Elizabeth Drinker and her sister Mary Sandwith reportedly struggled to find and keep, quote, good servants. In Elizabeth's diary, she excitedly noted the arrival of English ships carrying fresh waves of servants and described Mary's trips to the wharf, hunting for men and women to fill their constant vacancies. So I bring up America only because in my dissertation, I'm doing a comparative dissertation, and I'm comparing Philadelphia with London. And I have found that even though American colonial cities were much smaller and had this very different relationship to the economy than the metropole did, their demands for employment agencies were actually quite similar. Both sets of populations were kind of at a loss for how to find out that employment intel. They just had no way to do it.
Systematized employment streams initially took the form of intelligence offices. These offices of intelligence served many purposes at once. They are arguably the grandfathers of classified intelligence networks, newspaper journalism, advertising agencies, employment agencies, and several other things. Intelligence offices initially produced publications which spread intelligence around the city. But they were also brick and mortar points of contact where readers could follow up leads that were printed in their bulletins. Intelligence offices became popular in London and other major British cities, Bristol, Manchester, Leeds, and Edinburgh, at the beginning of the 18th century. They began appearing in cities and British colonies such as Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, and New York after 1750, but there were very few of them in British America until the 1780s. This was also the time when American newspapers reached maturity. This accident of timing may have shaped American intelligence agencies in compelling ways. While European offices functioned independently alongside newspapers for decades, American intelligence offices were more likely to be contained within the newspaper industry.
The first intelligence office was established in London in 1637 by John Innes. Innes secured from monarch Charles I a 41-year patent, which gave him sole rights to, quote, enter the names of all masters and mistresses and servants and of things lost and found, etc., within the cities of London and Westminster and 3 miles distant, end quote. I love how often 18th century and 17th century writers put etc. in there. Like, it'll be like the super important, like, bill going through Parliament, and it'll be like blah blah blah, etc.
Right.
It's so
You'd
funny.
think that you'd need to be a little bit more specific
be
than
specific,
that,
right? So basically, Innis planned to keep a register of employers seeking workers, servants seeking places, and items which were lost and found around the city. Londoners who sought servants, employment, or a lost watch could visit the Office of Intelligence and consult its register of leads. It's entirely unclear how Innis's intelligence agency made money. He likely sold access to the register in some way, perhaps selling subscriptions. He may have even sold space in the register, so if you wanted to place an item on the register, you'd have to pay for it. But it's unclear if anyone would have been willing to pay for that service at this point, because this is like a brand new thing, and nobody's heard of this before. So we have zero clue about how it actually worked.
Weird. Interesting. Towards the end of the 1600s, intelligence offices more commonly published an intelligence bulletin, which were pasted on posts and notice boards and circulated among the city residents by hand. This marriage between intelligence office registers and newspaper print may have begun in Germany sometime around the 1670s. Wilhelm Baron von Schroeder consulted Emperor Leopold about the establishment of an intelligence chamber, which would publish intelligence bulletins in the style of newspapers every 7 to 14 days. His proposal is the first record we have of an intelligence office designed to circulate publications. But von Schroeder was a famed mercantilist who envied the growing British mercantile juggernaut. He often related reports from London notables to Emperor Leopold so English economic practices could be implemented in Vienna. It's likely that he borrowed this idea from ordinary Londoners who were already circulating their registers in an informal capacity. We just haven't uncovered any record of those activities.
Right. I just want to mention that because just because that's the first record of it doesn't mean that people weren't doing it for hundreds of years.
Right.
We're not totally sure. For several decades, so approximately 1680 to 1720, I'm trying to go roughly chronologically here, the London intelligence industry circulated publications separately from the newspaper media. So there was very little crossover until the 1720s when intelligence offices began to purchase space in London newspapers. And this move made sense. Why incur the burdensome cost of printing your own bulletin when the local newspapers were willing to sell space to whoever was willing to pay? This move saved London intelligence offices oodles of money, and it also made them dependent on the newspaper medium. By mid-century, this made intelligence offices particularly vulnerable to the vagaries of public opinion. There were several competing intelligence offices operating in London, which had been advertising the labor of their clients in London newspapers since the 1720s. In attempts to edge out their competitors, they began rebranding as register offices and statute halls, all vying for different but overlapping target markets.
The first mention of a register office in London newspapers dates to 1742. It advertises the opening of the General Register Office within the piazza, I love that word,
Me too,
of the Royal Exchange. The ad gives us an idea of how these agencies were reinventing themselves. It reads, "Whatever is necessary for the public to be informed of or inquire after, such as bank or other notes, watches, or any other goods lost, stolen, or found, many of which are never heard of by the owners for want of those who find them, or to whom they are offered to sale or pawn, knowing who they belong to, which is registered at this office, may be informed gratis, and warnings may be sent to all goldsmiths, watchmakers, and pawnbrokers. Also, estates, annuities, offices, merchandise, etc., may be sold by being registered. Since this office being at the exchange, it may become a kind of market for the intercourse of such as have ready money purchase and those that will sell cheap." Here's something about the 18th century.
What?
How did anybody understand what the anybody else was talking about?
I know, they're so roundabout.
I mean,
Everything.
that makes
Everything.
zero sense.
So basically, okay, and I'll translate because
Thank you.
I
think that's a good idea.
I have a few long quotes, so I'll translate because I'm used to this. So basically, they're saying, if you lose anything, they're kind of saying it's kind of like an infomercial. Like, have you ever lost anything? And no one, you can't figure out who found it.
In the background, there's a guy who trips dramatically,
clumsily losing. And then, well, we have a solution. Just register your item and we'll notify all the pawnbrokers. So then if someone goes to pawn your goods, they'll notify you. They'll
Got
know
it.
it's stolen, blah, blah, blah.
Got it.
I don't know why they can't just say it. But, and then they also say that, that you can get a mortgage, you can negotiate sale of estates and things like that through the register. And it continues. So this is the end of the quote that Sarah was just reading. Don't worry, I will also translate. It says, quote, persons wanting to let or borrow money on mortgage or other security may have their business negotiated at this office, and secrecy may be depended on in the affair. Farms, houses, lodgings, etc. may be let, since any person may be informed what is registered and take such as suits each one's conveniency. And when let, it is hoped the landlords will give notice to the office to prevent needless enquiry. End quote. So they're basically saying, so the plan is that we will put this on the register if, someone is trying to lease an apartment. And when the apartment is taken, the landlord will tell us and we'll take it off the register. And then you don't need to go to this landlord's house and say, do you still have that apartment for sale? So basically they're trying to advertise their services in a very commercial kind of way, but just in a very 18th century roundabout, we don't know how to write way. So you can see this General Register Office is trying to give readers an idea of the possible services they can provide. They wanted to focus more on bringing parties together for transactions or other services revolving around making, spending, or recovering lost money.
Once intelligence offices and register offices started advertising in newspapers regularly, we as historians can learn more about them. Thankfully, many newspapers were saved for posterity and conveniently digitized. Random 18th century bulletins by any number of ordinary intelligence businesses? Not so much. The General Register Office, for example, charged 1 shilling for clients to register something. This included a notice being sent out to local establishments to be on the lookout for stolen or lost items. They charged another shilling if the client wanted their item advertised in the local newspaper. This tells us that they have some special working relationships with the local papers because for ordinary folks, a classified advertisement would cost 3 shillings on its own. So they were probably able to negotiate super low rates with newspapers since their clients would then have a vested interest in reading that paper above all others. The General Register Office was open for business from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Banker's hours. Like really short.
I know.
Before and after hours, clients were encouraged to go to the Amsterdam Coffee House where the proprietor would take register entries and advertisements while the office was closed. This was probably another negotiated deal. The Amsterdam Coffee House likely did this labor for free while the register office was closed because it brought in a steady stream of customers. Seems like a pretty, straightforward deal.
Right. So this is all kind of, the reason I include those things are just sort of because there's this commercial revolution going on. Yeah. People are learning how to market and do these different things. And a lot of people who are more familiar with modern history don't realize that people have figured this out so early, I guess.
Yeah.
In the U.S., the Industrial Revolution hadn't happened yet, so I'm just kind of making it clear that these are very commercialized societies. Mm-hmm. Register offices did not always take this form. Each agency carved out their own niche within the intelligence business. The choice of name, so intelligence office, register office, or statute hall, was a marketing choice rather than a strict division of services. So just because it's called statute hall doesn't mean it offers this service and register, it's all just sort of marketing gimmicks. The first reference to a statute hall in London newspapers dates to 1763. It announces the opening of Statute Hall by Tottenham Court Road. It's just called Statute Hall. It's not the Statute Hall. It's not John Statute Hall. It's just called Statute Hall. And that was also a marketing technique because they were like, it is Statute Hall, like as if it is the only one. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't. There was hundreds. This establishment pretty obviously captured a different market than register offices. So this is really short, and this is how they kind of advertise their services. The proprietors give notice. They shall, for the future, open their hall 2 days in every week from 11 to 2 o'clock for hiring servants and apprentices, every Monday for women and girls only, and every Thursday for men and boys only. Several tradesmen want apprentices on each day. So basically, they're only going to be open 2 days for a few hours each.
And you can only get certain people on certain days. And yeah.
Right.
This was obviously a very different venture than the register office we mentioned earlier. Statute halls typically made money by charging employers for the convenience of being able to show up at the statute hall at a given time and be guaranteed a servant for hire. It eliminated the inconvenience of going servant hunting, like Elizabeth Drinker and her sister were forced to do in Philadelphia. Statute halls also, at least supposedly, did some of the footwork that would otherwise need to be performed by employers every time they took on a new servant, checking their references, negotiating a minimum wage, and ensuring their basic suitability for employment. This theoretically assured employers that they weren't unwittingly hiring disabled, pregnant, or criminal servants. I say supposedly and theoretically because statute halls were often accused of failing to perform basic vetting, letting all kinds of transgressive characters fall through the cracks. Heaven forbid. Statute halls also, controversially, made money by charging the servants for the service of setting them up with an employer. This practice became incredibly problematic, and we'll come back to that soon.
Competing agencies, intelligence offices, register offices, and statute halls, all of them, took to attacking each other through newspaper advertisements in the 1760s. The owner of the London Statute Hall in Church Lane placed the following advertisement in the Public Advertiser on May 27, 1767, letting Londoners know why he started his new venture. And this is like, he's throwing some serious shade. And it's just amazing to me that... like, he's a professional, and this is, like, considered professional at a certain time. It's kind of like if someone now, you know, like, got fired from somewhere and they're, like, shit-talking their employer on Facebook or whatever, and you think, oh, that's, like, kind of inappropriate or whatever. But peoples will do it. But so it's kind of like that.
Peoples will do it.
Peoples will do it. So, quote, to extricate the public from the many impositions practiced by keepers of intelligence offices and to open a public market for this purpose was the chief motive that introduced me at a very great expense to build these two halls in order that every master and mistress might at a very small expense provide themselves with proper servants. This soon induced several of the office keepers to change their motto from register office to statute halls, which are now too numerous in this metropolis. Therefore, both parties would do well to consider that more places than one opened at one time. It is contrary to their own interests, which I have often repeated in my former advertisements and believe now is visibly perceived to be true by great numbers. So basically, translation, he's saying, I built these buildings, these statute halls, with my own money at great expense because I care deeply about masters and mistresses being able to find good servants. And
Right.
I'm providing this service to you, unlike all the other intelligence offices, which they're all crooks.
In London, this hostile environment was fodder for satire by London engravers like John Goldar, Philip Daw, and Thomas Rowlandson. We'll put some of these etchings in the blog post, so that you can take a look at what we're talking about here. All three types of agencies were accused of swindling their clients. The agency depicted in Goldar's etching bears the name Cheadle's Statute Hall. Employment agencies were known to charge their unemployed clients an entire day's wages, 2 shillings, at a time when the majority of working people spent 1/3 of their income on bread and an additional 1/6 of their income on basic lodging. Yeesh. The expense would have been justified if their services guaranteed employment, but this wasn't always the case. In most cities around the Atlantic Rim, the economies were labor rich. On July 12, 1764, a writer for the London Gazetteer and New Daily Advertiser estimated that intelligence offices drew 50, 60, or 70 workers per day and, took all of their shillings, while very few of them were selected by an employer on any given day. Several agencies were criticized for manufacturing false characters for their clients who were otherwise undesirable. They were also accused of failing to vet the employers who subscribed to their services, even though this was one of their primary functions. Workers were unable to trust that the agency would not connect them with abusive or miserly employers.
Sir John and Henry Fielding abandoned the private employment agency business after it became clear that market forces rendered them either unsuccessful or exploitative. The Fieldings and their partner, Saunders Welsh, established the Universal Register Office in London in 1749. The competitive and exploitative nature of the business made the Fieldings incredibly unhappy. So in 1761, they left the business to their clerk and got out of the intelligence game. The Fieldings later proposed a bill in Parliament which sought to regulate intelligence offices. As is often the case, the bill was initially proposed because the powerful and wealthy were fed up with the state of affairs. And that's just me being cynical. So, there were lots of problems for workers, but and they had been complaining about it for decades.
Right.
But then finally, wealthy people who were actually hiring people from these places started complaining, and then they were like, we need to take care of this.
Yeah. Typical, right?
Right. So, quote, we hear frequent complaints of the dissatisfied temper and covetousness of servants and the exorbitant wages they usually demand. Now it seems very probable that a proper attention to their characters, which once again means references, would make a great alteration in that particular. It would render them more modest in their demands and would teach them to look rather for services in which they could foresee a likelihood to continue long than one where they might get the most plunder. It is well known that many of the evils generally complained of have been occasioned by the bad practices carried on by register offices.
The bill goes on to describe their worst offense. The practice in the common register office of deceiving poor, deluded female servants particularly claims attention, as it is a grand source of infinite mischief. Those offices can any time procure them places. Their behavior to their employers becomes intolerable, and they are discharged without character, again, references. They again have recourse to the register office, and with the help of a false character, get into another.
So don't worry, everyone. They're also slightly concerned with the welfare of these female servants.
Slightly.
This part of the bill is the most bizarre part to me, and I think hopefully I don't need to translate these. These are a little easier reading. Do you think? So, yeah. So, quote, and this is also just a short one, quote, but as this cannot long be carried on when their faces become familiar, they, from fatal necessity, become a prey to their own passions, the pimp and the debauchee. And that is one of the chief causes which throw so many abandoned women on the town. If register offices are necessary, as perhaps they are, they ought to be under some better regulation and not to be left at liberty to impose a profligate woman or a villain upon a family, where one or the other may prove the destruction of it. That's right, folks. Parliament was worried that the awful practices of register offices were not only a bane to wealthy employers, but they were also making female servants into prostitutes. Now, there was some truth to this in the sense that poor and resourceless women often went in and out of the sex trade to make ends meet. But somehow, I feel like Parliament was not all that concerned about the fate of these women. The bill emphasizes that their fate is burdensome on the town and that they destroyed the families who employed them. There was very little concern about how sex work shaped their lives. And this just kind of makes me grumpy because so few people cared about the actual feelings of poor people in the 18th century.
Right, yeah. Criticisms towards employment agencies do not appear to have hindered the industry, but as the century progressed, servants were increasingly likely to invest in their own classified advertisements looking for open places. Classified advertisements emerged as an alternative to what people were beginning to perceive as ineffective and exploitative employment agencies. But just as anonymized employment networks continue to function next to old personal networks, register offices and statute halls continued to function alongside classified ads placed by servants themselves. This was partly due to the economics. By 1790, the cost to run a single ad for a single day ranged from 3 shillings 6d to 5 shillings 6d, depending on length and placement. Considering the average laborer earned 40 to 50 shillings annually, placing an ad would have cost the equivalent of 3 to 4 weeks' wages. Granted, statute halls also took servants' money without finding them places. But since an advertisement was more expensive than a day at the statute hall, many servants still gambled on the statute hall.
So our listeners might be wondering, what on earth does this have to do with wet nursing?
Good question. I was wondering the same. No, I'm just kidding.
I came across this little slice of history when I was collecting classified ads placed for and by wet nurses in London and Philadelphia. And as it turns out, wet nurses were among the droves of unskilled workers who flocked to cities looking for work. And I wanted to know how this discrete group of people were impacted by these labor changes because, frankly, their stories are compelling, largely untold, and important to understanding how we perceive women even today. So something I want our listeners to understand is that wet nurses didn't come to the city already planning on being a wet nurse. More often than not, they migrated to the city in search of a domestic service position, but somewhere along the way, they became pregnant outside of wedlock, abandoned by their lovers, and made the arguably smart choice to leverage their assets, which would be their boobs.
Nice.
Many times their infants passed away, but just as often, wet nurses surrendered their children to poor relief agencies. So how did someone who was newish to the city with few family or friends find a family who had an infant in need of breast milk who could afford the wages, room, and board of a wet nurse? See, these people would not have been in the same circles.
Right. So how did they find each other?
Right.
Right.
And normally it would be personal networks like, oh, my aunt used to be your cook or whatever.
Yeah.
But these people are new to the city. They don't have those personal networks.
One way was by placing classified ads. The first wet nurse ad in London was placed in the 1730s. Wet nursing advertisements increased as the century progressed. By the 1790s, some dailies were publishing several wet nurse advertisements every day. The exponential growth of employment agencies and job classifieds between 1750 and 1815 suggests that personal networks were no longer effective for everyone in those places. But buying ad space was a considerable investment. As we mentioned earlier, this could cost several weeks' wages for somebody who was obviously already unemployed. Wet nurses probably saw other avenues of procuring a place, and householders likely saw other avenues of procuring wet nurses before they placed classified ads.
Right, so this is probably not the starting point. This is probably placing a classified ad is like, hey, I'm super desperate.
Yeah.
Or maybe like sometimes you might have been a wet nurse already and your employer says, hey, I'll place this ad for you like as a gift for being such a great servant. Sometimes that happens.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Employment agencies were an alternative strategy for these women. I came across many register office ads that basically listed a bunch of people looking for places. So day laborers, footmen, scullery maids, nurses, clerks, wet nurses. I also noticed that many of those people looking for places did not find jobs after the first advertisement ran because the same clients appear again and again. And so I wanted to know how women chose whether they'd place an advertisement on their own or whether they'd subscribe to a register office. Some of the problems with register offices that we mentioned earlier, so their dishonesty and exploitative natures, suggest that employment agencies offered wet nurses in particular some important advantages. Many of these wet nurses were poor, unmarried, uneducated, unskilled, and what many of their contemporaries considered to be fallen women. So employment agencies could theoretically rehabilitate these women into suitable servants. They had the resources to fabricate good references for them. So these references, who most employers would consult in person, could feign familiarity with a wet nurse and tell some sob story about how she was a respectable married woman whose husband went off to sea or whatever, and she's not like a fallen woman.
Okay.
And then the prospective employer would be like, great, she sounds great, and hire her.
Yeah. Wet nurses actually did this. Marissa has read many petitions written by women surrendering their children to the Foundling Hospital in London. These women told stories to the hospital designed to cultivate sympathy toward their situation so that they would take their child. But everyone required references, and the hospital sent fact checkers to see each reference in person to ask whether the applicant was a suitable object of charity. That seems bonkers.
Yeah.
Like, who has the time and the resources to send fact checkers? But
these are like rich white men.
What I will say, I kind of sorry to interrupt the flow here, but somebody asked me at a conference recently. We were talking about the pensions and how difficult it was often for a veteran to apply for a pension, and they were always accused of fraud or whatever. And somebody was like, well, but they probably weren't checking, right? And I was and I was like, oh no, they were they had.
Oh, they were checking.
Yeah, they had people that were employed by the Pension Bureau who went out and investigated people, followed them, tailed them to make sure that they were actually disabled. So it does not actually surprise me. As much as I say that this is bonkers, it doesn't actually surprise me that they had people who were doing this.
Right, and they were very organized about it. They would take the petition that the woman wrote to the Foundling Hospital, to wherever they were going to check on the reference, and they would write notes of what the person said about them on the back of it. So on the back of every petition, you have the investigator writing down, okay, this person says that, yeah, she was married, or this person says she and this guy pretend to be married, but they're definitely not, and she's like a whore.
Jeez, wow.
So I'm going to add up until the 1960s and early 1970s in the U.S., somebody would come and check in people's houses if there was like a man living in the house. So even if it was like a boyfriend or something like that, if you were applying for welfare benefits, they would come in like in the middle of the night to see if there was a man sleeping in your house. And if there was, then you would get kicked off of welfare because obviously you had a man to support you and your children.
Wow.
And so you'd get kicked out. So yeah. They still check. I mean, in mine that I'm about to do, I'm going to talk about how somebody was calling to check on some bullshit about me and like kick me off the welfare.
Yeah.
Right.
So. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, I know that like workers' compensation, they do something similar. I mean, it's not, that obviously, but they do they will have private investigators tail people who are applying for workers' comp to see if they actually are as disabled as they say. So this has a very long and interesting history. I just had to pause there and say that because I find this really fascinating. Anyway, so there are so many petitions which are refuted by references, and there are even more references who admit their complicity in hiding a woman's past transgressions just so that she can gain employment, which, makes sense. I mean, helping your friend, right?
Right, exactly.
This was really a common thing. It's kind of like, faking a resume. You kind of expand, you put things on your CV that maybe, put a couple of those book reviews on there that are just for lame
What are you
things.
No.
Oh, I have book reviews that I don't even put on my CV.
I think it's
no, I'm just kidding.
No, I think it's like a fake. So I have this stat here
padding.
That 58% of employers today have caught people lying on resumes.
58%.
And my boss, who works in higher ed because I am a GA in the grad school, she told me that she had to go to some seminar about academic integrity and when it came to the application process. And they told her a stat that's something like if everybody who said that they graduated from Harvard actually had graduated from Harvard, there would be 4 million people who
diploma
couldn't possibly have gone to Harvard or something.
That's wild.
Ridiculous. And I guess it's really common in India where you could just walk on the streets and be like, hey, here's a Harvard diploma. And they'll put your name on it or whatever.
I have heard of diploma mills where you can just kind of get fake diplomas, and they'll if you submit your application someplace and say that you went to blah, blah, blah university and you need a transcript. There are fraudulent places where you can get fake transcripts. But that to me, I'm oh my gosh, you're going to get caught so easy, dude. Why would you do that? But
no, they do get caught. So.
But there is a phenomenon in academia of padding your CV, and that's not lying. That's, I did this thing when I was in undergrad, and so I'm going to put that on my CV, even though, you shouldn't put stuff.
It's arguably
you
not
shouldn't
relevant.
Put stuff from your undergrad on your CV, unless it was something really, you were a Fulbright or something, we all try to do that to a certain extent. Anyway, the 18th century public were aware of this part of the trade, this kind of fraud, right? Physician George Armstrong lamented in 1783. He said this: a good wet nurse is not always to be had, especially in or near great cities, where so many of them are given to drinking and other vices, and the worst of them will fall upon means of securing a good character. Families were particularly nervous about this possibility for deception because this woman was being hired to breastfeed their child, right? I mean, if she was a loose woman, she could have a venereal disease. She could be immoral. She could be an alcoholic. She could be unfit to be around children. Or even worse, she could be mentally ill.
Worse according to them, not according to
us.
Yes,
of course. I mean, from their perspective. Yeah.
Right.
One physician, an opponent to the wet nurse trade, wrote, when wet nurses go mad, the tiny bodies of innocent infants pay for it.
Yeah. So this anxiety about deception is critical to my argument about the ways that wet nurses and their bodies were treated. Householders were told by physicians and authors of advice manuals to demand sobriety, honesty, discretion, conscientiousness, patience, good humor, and friendliness in a wet nurse. And they were urged to avoid women who were unchaste, or gossipy or anxious or flighty or particularly passionate or melancholy, which would be depressed. They were told to avoid unmarried women, women who suffered from chronic want, or women married to abusive husbands. These details about a woman's personality, lifestyle, and family situation were easy to uncover through social networks when prospective wet nurses were introduced to householders by mutual acquaintances. For centuries, London families with resources had inquired among friends, neighbors, and business contacts when searching for servants. Workers in London inquired among their social and familiar networks for open places. But how exactly could prospective employers ascertain this intel if their prospective wet nurse was a stranger to them, which was increasingly the case? There were several factors that householders took into account when evaluating women for employment as a wet nurse, but their impression of a prospective wet nurse's character was increasingly influenced by an inspection of her body. So, as an alternative to social knowledge that they would gather from like a personal network, householders sought information by inspecting a wet nurse's body. So, with the help of medical manuals and conduct lit, householders read wet nurses' bodies for signs of their health, their character, and their past behavior. So yes, they had them stripped down so that they could inspect their bodies and gather clues about her character or her behavior based on how her body looked.
Ooh.
So I know, just
I hate to think
horrifying.
what people would think if they had to,
Look at me naked. I know.
Yeah.
So if you want to know more, you have to read my dissertation or buy the book that I'm going to make out of it in a year or two. Okay. No, but really, I'll give you one tidbit as an example. Women who had like sagging or like floppy breasts were considered to be that was considered to be a sign that she was immoral or loose or had sex with lots of men because her breasts were like well used. So they would be like, oh no, like, I mean, it's not like it was an automatic deal breaker, but if
like there was a
couple, like if she
them.
had crappy teeth and she had saggy boobs, then it's like, no, that's too much for me. Bye.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of one example. I mean, there's a million other examples of ways that you can look at a part of someone's body and think that about their character and their behavior.
Yeah. So this isn't related. I mean, this isn't specifically about breasts or breastfeeding, but this reminds me of something that I must have read recently about increased numbers of women going for like labiaplasties who want their labia to look porny.
Yeah.
Right? They want their labia to look like vaginas in porn.
Right.
Right. And part of it is because a lot of men have absorbed this idea that labia that are longer or are bigger or are different shapes indicates a woman that has been well used. Like you say, like big boobs or boobs that are like sagging or whatever indicate a woman's body has been like well handled by men.
And she's been around the block.
Exactly. So like, if your labia look not like perfect, porn star vagina, then it's indicating that you're a whore, basically.
Right.
Which is just so horrifying and sexist.
Yeah. And it's not, I mean, there's no truth to that whatsoever.
No.
But for whatever reason, that's people's impressions. And so that's this chapter I'm working on right now. I'm working on kind of taking apart those perceptions that people have about women's bodies at the time to try to sort of like decode like, okay, well, if they saw like a mole here, what did they think? And it gets into like witchcraft stuff a little bit too. There was a lot of witches who were whose sagging breasts were thought to be a sign that they had engaged in tons of sex with the devil or whatever.
Right.
And it's something that they always show, like if they show a witch being burned in Europe or something, they'll show maybe a drawing of it. She always has these like gross saggy boobs, even if she's not
sort
old.
Of that
like pendulous
typical,
breasts.
like witch image that you have. Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why breasts were perceived that way.
Yeah.
And there are very, very lurid descriptions of what you want in a breast.
Yeah.
And you want the breast to be big and full and have tons of milk in it, but you also want it to like look chaste.
Right.
Whatever the F that means.
How does a breast look chaste?
Because
it looks young, it looks perky, it looks relatively.
And the nipples aren't like super dark because sometimes your nipples and your get a lot darker when you're pregnant and postpartum, and like that's a totally normal thing.
Yeah.
So a totally normal part of being postpartum, you have to be postpartum and have all this milk, but
right.
you can't have breasts that look like they're postpartum.
That's
so
exactly. Yeah. I mean, all of these processes, right? Like it's not because this woman like was, say a woman has like pendulous or large or drooping breasts, right? That's part of being pregnant and breastfeeding. Like you have no control over that. There's literally nothing you can do. Like your boobs are going to do what your boobs do. I mean, having breastfed now 3 children, my boobs look significantly different and are shaped different and are different size than they were when I first started having kids.
Right.
And it just makes me think of the ways that like women are expected to perform certain functions in society, but they are also punished for performing those functions. Like women are supposed to be fertile and have children, but like you also need to somehow get back to that pre-baby body like immediately, because otherwise you're fat and lazy and you're not taking care of yourself.
You're supposed to breastfeed your kids, but your boobs can't look like you breastfed your kids.
Right.
Yeah, and so and I still see a lot of these problems today, and that's why this kind of thing interests me.
Yeah.
And I want to make clear the connection between like the employment agencies and this. That's just kind of a little bit of history that I think is very unknown. There's not a history of employment agencies or anything like that. And
it's
the thing that's interesting about it is that, my argument is that suddenly wet nurses their bodies are being handled differently and perceived differently. And we see this in art. They'll show wet nurses as like these old hags with drooping boobs and missing teeth, and they're holding a gin bottle. And it's like, they're like disgust. They're like grotesque.
Right.
And it's like, where did that come from? Because in other countries, because I'm working on England, in like France or the Netherlands, they show pictures of wet nurses and they're like beautiful and soft and sweet and young, and they're holding this little baby, and then the mother sits there beside her and they're like besties. So I'm trying to figure out where this came from, and I think one of the things is that people were having anxiety about like not knowing these people that they were bringing into their home.
Yeah.
And they were trying to find ways to figure out to like suss out like crappy nurses or like people who shouldn't have the job, people who were not suitable.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the ways they did it was by the inspection.
Yeah. So. But also through this system of advertising and vetting people through references and all that. I mean,
and I mentioned that they used to just use notice boards. It was really common in the 17th century. They would send them sometimes to like someone would say, "Hey, I'm looking for a wet nurse. Go to the blacksmith on Church Street for information." So then you'd go to the blacksmith on Church Street and he would do the initial vetting for his friend who's looking for a wet nurse.
Interesting.
And if this woman was all like pocky and like had venereal disease, he would be like, "Yeah, no thanks."
Yeah.
And so that would be the first like layer of vetting. But if she looked great, he would say, "Okay, well, here's the address of my friend who actually wants the wet nurse." And then she would go there. And then, so there were all these different layers of vetting.
Something that has always interested me in your work is, in the United States, when you talk about wet nurses, at least from my background, and of course, this is certainly not the inclusive history of wet nurses in the United States, as you're demonstrating, right? I mean, Philadelphia, but a lot of times we're talking about enslaved women. And one of the things that I don't know a lot about this, but I suspect, is that there's this constant tension within slavery of sort of not trusting your slaves, never trusting your slaves, but also having to look like you trust your slaves. Do you know what I mean? Like this weird dynamic where you have to sort of you have to kind of pretend that you love them and that you're going to take care of them well and that you trust them and they're part of your family, but you're actually think that they're inhuman. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so something that I find really interesting about this is how it can be possible to hate Black people, right? Think that they are disgusting and say and buy into the literature and the rhetoric and the ideology of slavery, but also give your infant to an enslaved woman and ask her to nourish them from her own breasts. I mean, I think it gets into a lot of the stuff that you're talking about kind of this fear of who are you bringing into your house, who are you giving this child to, you never quite know, but also you can't, at least with enslaved women, you can't you can't really demonstrate too much that you don't trust them because they're supposed to be part of this fiction that you're a loving family.
Yeah. It's a weird thing. And I think a lot of scholars haven't figured that out yet. Mm-hmm. And I think, at least I can say that in Europe, they thought it was extremely bizarre that...
right. I mean, it makes no logical sense to enslave people because they are subhuman and they can't take care of themselves, but also give your infant to a black woman and say, feed this child
care for this thing
with
here.
your bodily fluids, which I think are disgusting and horrible because they're coming out of your body, but feed them to my
it doesn't,
newborn. I mean,
it makes you think that there was two layers. There was one layer of, oh yeah, we think you're all subhuman and horrible and whatever, but then there's also that other layer of, well, it's probably fine.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that, I see that a lot just with you know, white women in London, you know, they're like, oh my God, you know, I want a woman who's married. And then a woman will show up and be like, I was married. And then they'll ask the reference and the reference will say, no, she wasn't. And then they're like, it'll
probably be okay.
Let's just say she's married and it's fine.
Yeah.
And so there is like two different levels. There's like what other people know and what you show to other people.
Right. Yeah.
And then what you're really thinking, which is sometimes more pragmatic and sometimes more just like F it, because people are just complex and we just do that.
Yeah.
So I think that is part of that. And also, at least in the 18th century, people believed that you could pass race on to your nursling.
Yes.
So that is the strangest part about mammies, is that they actually thought that you could like blackify someone. Yes. And you know, there would be like white children who would visit the UK in the 19th century and be talking to whoever, and they would be like, oh my God, like you're one of the children who was fed by like a black woman. You're so pale. Like, how is that possible? Right. And it kind of reminds me of like, I don't know, like biracial kids who like are lighter than people think they're supposed to be, or darker than they're supposed to be, or whatever. And people are like, oh my God, like, you know, and, you know, it's very weird and strange and gross. Right. But they were just absolutely convinced that race was, like, transmittable. Mm-hmm. And that it was a spectrum. Race was a spectrum. And it's like, if it was a spectrum...
that you could move on.
But if it was a spectrum, why are you enslaving people on one end of the spectrum if you're on the same spectrum as them?
Right.
It's a very bizarre thing, and... they didn't have it figured out themselves, and that's why we can't figure it out.
Why it's so hard for historians,
Yeah, it's just not... it's not rational.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's not. All right. So that's all the boobs for one day. So if you haven't yet, you can review us and rate us on iTunes, on Stitcher, on wherever you listen to podcasts.
Visit our website. It's digpodcast.org. Mm-hmm. You can get transcripts of the episodes. You can get descriptions of
lots of pictures. I know we mentioned a couple of like engravings that we're going to put up.
Yep. So you can see what these actual statute halls and things looked like.
Right.
We have a Facebook group called the Dig History Pod Squad. Just search us on Facebook and ask to join. Mm-hmm. It's still a pretty small group, so it's nice and tame and it's a good time. Mm-hmm. And
follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. You can email
LinkedIn. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Well, this is about
networking.
Business networking, right?
We need to get in LinkedIn.
Yeah. Start a LinkedIn group. If you have, if you want to talk to us about the episode, if you want to ask Marissa questions about her absolutely fascinating research, you can email us at hello@digpodcast.org. We love hearing from people, as long as you're nice.
And we like to read emails on the air too.
Yes.
So
if you're mean, we will definitely read it on the air and make fun of
you. And mock you endlessly.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
All right. That's it. We will see you next time. Goodbye forever.
Bye.
That sounds dirty.
Fill my constant vacancies. Ooh. I'm Marissa Rhodes.
And I'm Sarah Handley Cousins. It annoys me.
Should we just do the first name?
I always just do first name. Why didn't you do the whole name?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Everybody knows our last name.
No, yeah, I don't care. So...
unlike in England, in the American colonies... Holy open apps, girlfriend.
It's like my brain.
Yep.
All right.
Hold on.
Boobs.
Boobs.